Yeah. So thank you for being here. You are at Moral Mondays. I hope everybody's in the right room. So we are a group of organizations collaborating together to bring voice to progressive issues here at the State House, giving everyone a chance to dive into a number of issues that may or may not receive kind of the bandwidth that they deserve in the official proceedings at the Capitol. So we're glad to have all of you here today. Today I am thrilled to have some great folks here to talk about vouchers, which is an issue that I think many of us had thought, had hoped was done and settled for this session, and unfortunately it has come back. So I will let folks talk about that, but we have here today with us Senator Jeff Danielson from Cedar Falls and Melissa Peterson, who is the Government Relations Specialist for the Iowa State Education Association. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Senator Danielson. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing us together today to have hopefully what's a good discussion about the bill that's before us. A little bit about me. I'm Senator Jeff Danielson. I represent Senate District 30, which is commonly known as the Cedar Valley. So Waterloo, Cedar Falls, and Hudson. I believe that my district is the education capital of Iowa because it is the home of the University of Northern Iowa Teachers Program, where we train the best teachers in the world, always have since our beginnings as the Iowa State Teachers College, and then subsequently the University of Northern Iowa. I have every form of education known to man in my district, from public, private, and nonprofit, all the way from PK to postgraduate. And so I think our approach in the Cedar Valley, given the different types of education and the ways in which Iowans choose to receive that education, when we have an issue of public policy before us that requires a difficult decision based on not just the budget but also the policy, we do it the Iowa way. We do it together. And we do it in a way that resolves problems constructively by treating people decent, doing our homework, and actually trying to solve the problem in front of us. So I'm happy that I was assigned to this bill because this bill does none of those things. None of them. So some of you may know that I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Northern Iowa. From time to time, they invite me back to teach a public policy class that's a part of the master's program of public policy that I graduated from. So I'm going to put on my adjunct professor's hat today, and I'm going to give this bill 3 F's for the following reasons. The first is it presents a false choice with a capital F based on a fake premise that somehow Iowans either want or need this type of choice that's in this bill. We do not. There are a number of ways in which Iowa families and students can access education. I just explained in my district you have virtually every one of them available. And we've never proposed bills like this that pit one level or one type of education against the other. This one clearly does it, and it does it with a zero-sum approach. Instead of my Republican friends coming up with a new idea or a new revenue source to expand choice for Iowans, they actually take from one type of education and give it to another. That is a false choice for which we should reject. It gets a second F because it's fiscally irresponsible. Why? Well, the state of Iowa at present can barely rub 2 nickels together in order to pay its bills that it has already obligated. And we are in the middle of the worst 8 years in Iowa history for investment in K-12 education. The worst 8 years as a measure of the overall economy and inflation, which is how you're supposed to look at it. My friends on the other side of the aisle try to talk about real dollars, and they're meaningful, and it's an investment that Iowa has traditionally made, but under their leadership, it has been the lowest investment in K-12 in the entire history of the funding formula over the last 8 years. Why is this fiscally irresponsible? Well, it robs from Peter to pay Paul. It also is very likely to increase property taxes because the school districts will try to recover some of that income for the loss of these students. And quite frankly, whatever we don't do at the state level, and I think this is a theme of the current leadership that we should keep in mind, whatever the state does not do in terms of its investments as a partnership with the local communities, you can bet your bottom dollar that it means they're going to raise property taxes to try to make up for that lack of effort on our part. And there are a number of ways in which this current leadership has done that. This is another one. So it is capital F, fiscally irresponsible to propose this legislation at this time. And then, more importantly, this bill deserves an F because it fails the Iowa fairness test. Mentioned a little bit in my district, when we have issues of public policy related to education, whether it's financing or policy, we find a way to work together and to make a problem-solving table that everybody can be a part of and be at. This does not. It is patently unfair to propose a bill like this, given the fact that our K-12 schools are already underfunded. They deal with many of the modern problems of the day for which we don't fairly fund them, right? Classrooms are different today, and yet we expect more and more from teachers and administrators in order to make that a healthy learning environment. This bill simply shifts resources away and addresses none of those issues. We have to get back to a place in Iowa politics where we treat each other fairly when we propose new policies. This bill fails the Iowa fairness test in spades, really, because of the way that it proposes the kind of change that it does. So I give it 3 Fs: false choice, fiscally irresponsible, and it fails the Iowa fairness test, all with capital Fs in a red pen. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'm honored to be with Melissa today as well.
Senator, I appreciate you being here today. I got one question. What percentage of the Iowa legislature send their kids to non-public schools?
That I don't know.
I've heard that,
so I don't know the actual percentage, but I would say there is probably a greater percentage today than there has historically in the past. And so you do have legislators who see a bill like this as something they wanted to do for quite a few years because they've never sent their kids to public schools. They're here now trying to shift some of those resources.
So in that case, would you say that they're dealing more with the private interest than with the public interest?
I think if you look at their priorities, right, the issues that are salient to those legislators, there's no doubt they're putting more energy and time in trying to get them passed.
I've heard that close to 40% of the Republican caucus in the House homeschools their kids. Is that, have you heard that percentage?
I'm not aware of that percentage.
Closer to 17%. I've never heard 40%.
Right. I do know, I can speak to the Senate. The 2 gentlemen that have been assigned to the bill said in the subcommittee that their kids go to private school. So, I mean, you could judge what you want for the motivations of the individual members. I tend not to focus on that. It's important to know it, obviously, but really the basics of this bill are just poor public policy for Iowa, regardless of who's proposing it.
As Aaron mentioned, my name is Melissa Peterson, and I'm a governmental relations specialist with the Iowa State Education Association. And my association represents nearly 34,000 public education professionals across the state. We have membership in all 99 counties, serving nearly all of our 333 school districts across the state. And our vital interests have to do with making sure that we are delivering the best public education possible to any and all of our more than 483,000 public school students across the state. And so this is an issue that is very important to us on a multitude of levels. But I would like to first take a moment to kind of connect to the wonderful 3Fs. I think that's a very wonderful way to talk about the subject. But I want to start with the fairness component, which was the third F from Senator Danielson. We have a responsibility in the state of Iowa to make sure that we are providing the best level of public service to the most number of people. And I would suggest that our elected officials were elected to do the exact same thing, to provide the best for the many. That doesn't mean we ignore the few. But it means that we have a responsibility to look out to the lion's share, or look after the well-being of the lion's share of our constituents. We know that approximately 94% of the entire student population in the state is public school students. The remainder is made up of an unquantifiable number of homeschool students, because for those of you who might not know, we stopped regulating that in 2013, unfortunately. And then the other remainder are non-public school students. So we assume about 34,000 students in Iowa are attending a non-public school. So if anyone wants to suggest that there are not options under the current state law for children to pursue non-public education, they would be wrong. And if anyone were to suggest that ISEA hates private school or hates anything that's not public school, they would also be wrong. We just don't believe that taxpayer dollars ought to go to fund a separate education system that does not hold itself to the same accountability and transparency that our public school system does. And it certainly should not occur, after Senator Danielson pointed out, after 8 years of terribly inadequate funding for our public education. So if anybody were able to come up with a magic pot of gold that we could use to spend on education, we would prefer that that be spent on public education until all of the needs of the 483,000 public school students are being met. If people were interested on the different types of choice that is available under existing Iowa code, it is important for us to recognize that we have all different types of education available in our public school system. We have public charter schools, we have magnet schools, we have concurrent enrollment programs, we have a very liberal open enrollment policy. If you do not like the school district for whatever reason, or if it's not convenient for you, your district of residence, there is an opportunity to open enroll out of that district. Additionally, people should also know that we already subsidize non-public education to the tune of approximately $44 million. Okay, so our state is already taking some of its resources and providing for non-public education services, but they're doing it in the interest of fairness. Those expenses include approximately $8.5 million for non-public school transportation, because it was decided quite a long time ago, if our public school bus was going to go along a route and there were not transportation services for non-public school students, it was in everyone's best interest to make sure that those kids got to that location safely, right? We also provide approximately $650,000 worth of support for textbooks at non-public schools. Additionally, we have almost $4 million of non-public schools receiving AEA services. Now, our AEAs are our area education agencies, and they are predominantly responsible in a non-public school setting for taking care of the needs of some of our most vulnerable students. That would be our special education students. We also provide $1.5 million of school aid formula expenditures for shared time personnel, again, to help meet the needs of the non-public schools. There is non-public state and federal aid provided for school lunch support in excess of $3 million. And then we have an additional $12 million STO, or school tuition organization, which are tax credits that are available to the general public as well as corporations, where they get a 65% tax credit return for making a donation to the school tuition organization. And we also provide an additional $15 million in tuition and textbooks tax credits to our non-public schools. Now, some people will tell you we spend $53 million instead of $43 million. That is because we spend an additional $9 million to subsidize what is called the Homeschool Assistance Program. So those would be homeschool students that decide to take advantage of some of the courses and opportunities we have in our public schools to the tune of about $9 million. So whether you want to say it's 44 or 53, the argument is that we are already doing what we can, again, to level the playing field and make sure that these kids are taken care of in the non-public school system. But it's important to recognize that there is an awful lot of choice in our existing system. Again, please remember there are lots of different opportunities for people to make decisions, what's best for their family, what's best for their student. And we think that those resources need to go to benefit the most number of students possible. We know that additional resources help manage our class sizes, they help improve our programming at our schools, they make sure that we can retain quality faculty in those programs. And again, to Senator Danielson's point, that has become a significant struggle for us in the last several years as we have found ourselves in less than stable revenue kind of projection times. And so it was really troubling to me last week when, again, an issue we thought that had gone away decided to pop back up and be moved through the appropriations process, not through the Education Committee, but through the Appropriations Committee. Senate Study Bill 3206 essentially says that we are going to allow a $4,000 voucher for any incoming kindergarten student or any student who's currently enrolled in a public school system that has not attended a non-public school the 2 semesters prior. And I think the reason why that was proposed is because it has a smaller price tag than just vouchers for any kid that might want it, for example. But I still believe, and we haven't had a fiscal note requested yet as we are waiting to see whether or not this gets proposed in front of a full committee, that we'd be looking at an initial expense of approximately $15 million. It could be higher than that, depending upon the number of people who might choose to take part in this system. $15 million is approximately half of the amount of money that was given to all public schools to cover those 483 public school students this year in the form of SSA. 1% growth is what we got this year because we're in troubling economic times, we were told by the majority parties in both chambers. 1% of SSA is approximately $32 million. We could have gotten an additional 0.5%, again, to benefit all of those public school students for what I believe the initial expense of this bill would be. And it's really important for me, and I'll stop talking here shortly, that even if someone wanted to move forward with a plan like this, that we focus on, again, the fairness issue. And that is to make sure that if you are going to receive the taxpayer dollars, you ought to be held to the exact same standards as those public service institutions from an accountability and a transparency standpoint. What I don't believe a lot of people are aware of is the fact that non-public schools, of which there are many in high standing that are very, very rigorous, do not have to adhere to the same acceptance from a student perspective regulations that we do at a public school, or the same employment standards that we do at a public school. So if a child has a severe behavioral disorder or perhaps a significant special need, if those services are not available at that non-public school, that child does not have to be enrolled. That is not an option at a public school. At a public school, we are proud to accept anyone and everyone, irregardless of their level of ability, their language background, their religious affiliation, anything. We are happy to take those students. It is our responsibility as public education professionals. That is not the case at a non-public school. Additionally, it's important for folks to understand that non-public schools, basically all of their employees are at will. Some of you might recall, if you are here from the central Iowa area, a couple of years ago, I believe it's 2016, there was a high-profile case where Dowling High School terminated a contract with a teacher because he was gay. And he was exposed or outed as being gay, and he was terminated consequently. We still have situations where women, if they get pregnant outside of marriage, are also being terminated at non-public schools. Things that are arguably unheard of in a public service setting or public employment setting. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want my tax dollars used to subsidize institutions that can do things like that, that don't have to accept all students, that don't have to provide adequate levels of services for our most vulnerable, and that also don't have to adhere to just general civil rights permissions, whether it has to do with their students or their employees. So for all of those reasons, we are certainly hopeful that this bill does not move forward, though it's entirely possible under the existing leadership structure in this beautiful state house of ours that it will see further discussion or committee action.
Can you repeat the bill number?
Yeah.
You're talking quite fast.
Oh, sorry, Senate Study Bill 3206. I do not believe it's been.
And that is
read.
also in the paperwork
Oh,
that you
okay,
guys have
thank you.
too,
I didn't
folks.
read that. I'm sorry.
Yes, Representative
Melissa
Miller.
or Senator, could you just comment on what happened in the House last week with the online learning academies that are located outside of the state of Iowa, and independent homeschoolers can now access tax dollars to go towards the tuitions of those out-of-state online academies, and where that's at, and maybe from the Senate side or from your comment there.
Sure. So you are talking about Senate File 475, which was an education omnibus bill that was started in the Senate last year. I believe it was a bill sponsored by Senator Amy Sinclair, who is the current chair of education in the Senate. That bill, thankfully, from our perspective, stalled out in the House last year, but the House has decided to take it up, and it was passed last week in the Iowa House. It, I believe, in its current form has 7 divisions. The division that Representative Miller was referencing is the first division. Prior to this bill, we had 2 pilot programs that allowed for online academies to contract with the CAM School District and the Clayton Ridge School District. I believe Clayton Ridge was contracted with Connections Academy, which is a for-profit education online provider. And the CAM district is contracted with another for-profit company called K-12 Inc. What happens is if, let's say hypothetically, your student is in its resident district of Des Moines, and for whatever reason they decide that they want to open enroll to participate in one of these online academies, they would open enroll into CAM or Clayton Ridge, who then contracts those services with the private vendor. So the CAM or Clayton Ridge district, we believe, hangs on to approximately $1,000 of a $6,700 per pupil funding amount every year. That $5,700 remainder goes directly to the for-profit company. Those children never have to be seen in a brick and mortar facility. Their education is delivered exclusively online. Many people will tell you that we have challenging rates of accomplishment at those online education institutions, or academy programs, if you will. Their math and reading scores are lower than those of our public school students that attend a brick and mortar building. But that's why it was a pilot program in its original conception. Division 1 of Senate File 475 blows the doors off of that program and allows any school district to contract with one of those private providers or to start their own online academy. Now, I appreciate we have lots of education professionals and school board members that are very attuned to what their district needs are, but an unregulated opportunity for a district to contract with a for-profit provider, both of those organizations, by the way, are currently in litigation with different states that were not delivered the expectation of services they originally thought they were contracting with. And then you factor in the homeschool component, where we have children who might enroll either in a HACCP program or who are traditionally homeschooled, who might take advantage now of these online academy programs. I'm all for, frankly, making our education system fit the student, right? We know we have some kids who, if you're in a terrible car accident and you can't go to school for 3 months because you're in traction, guess what? Our public schools will take care of you. We have an Iowa Learning Online program run through the Department of Education where you can receive your services. You can have home visits from your area education agency, right? We make these accommodations. We don't need to give our tax dollars away to highly unregulated for-profit companies that are traded on the stock market. If you are experiencing bullying in your building and you don't feel like you're being protected or taken care of, again, we have these pilot programs that on a limited basis you could enroll in to receive those services. We are very concerned about the prospect of potentially finding school districts that are entering into contracts that, frankly, some school districts could find themselves and the tax dollars being taken advantage of in an unregulated fashion. So that's a big concern that we have. Thank you for mentioning it. That now goes back to the Senate, and we'll see what happens there. But because it was initially a priority that Senator Sinclair has been working on for a period of almost 18 months now, I find it hard to believe that it will not move through the Senate.
If I might just add to that, every public school board in the state of Iowa, every community school has to have an annual audit. It's done by an outside company. They look over where every single dollar goes. And I know that happens. And then they come together with the superintendent, the business manager, and the school board president, and maybe one other, and they go over that audit every August or September. And they're told, if you're making a mistake or there's $1 or $2 here, you have to explain where every single dollar goes. These online academies are not under any type of an audit like that. It is money going out of state. The money is actually even being used to advertise for
Yes.
their own thing, and there are incentives to get
Recruit.
parents
Yep.
to enroll. And
Yep.
that is all our money that's doing that.
Yes. Something else, if I could just take a moment as folks are thinking of other questions, and I apologize, I don't have handouts, but the handouts are hard to read because this is a map that has different colors on it. This is part of a Department of Revenue presentation that was given, I believe, on November 27th of last year. You can find this on the Department of Revenue's website related to the the tax and tuition textbook tax credit. It's very hard to say very quickly. But what these different little flags represent are where people are currently taking advantage of the textbook and tuition tax credit that I mentioned that was in that $15 million of the $44 million that I said we were already spending on non-public schools. Do you notice where the flags aren't? It's important for us to pay attention to that because we essentially, let's say hypothetically, this bill, despite our overwhelming opposition, moves forward and a voucher system is put into place. Where there are not flags, those vouchers would do nothing to expand anyone's educational opportunity. Right? We have approximately 76,000 students in this state, about a fifth of that 483,000 number that I gave you before of currently enrolled public school students who do not have a non-public option in a county radius of their location. So if somebody tries to tell you this is about access or it's about choice, it's not choice for at least a fifth of our students. A fifth of our students, which again I would argue are taken care of, well served by our public educators at our public schools.
That's a part of the false choice
Yep.
of the bill. Appears to be something that's really not.
Got a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I heard this at the subcommittee meeting, talking about, well, yeah, the families can use up to 4,000, but 2,000 get to stay with the school, and the school is not going to be using, the child won't be there, so they'll have that extra money. So, but I also heard, like, if the child is not going to go there, they don't get counted, so there's no 6,000 to split. So can you talk a little bit about that? Or did I get that right?
I think that you're correct, and there's a way to do a comparison, right? Under Iowa's open enrollment policy, the per pupil funding follows the student, and then the categoricals stay with the school district of origin. And this is the Iowa fairness part of this. We don't want to pit public schools against each other, and we don't want to pit public schools against non-public schools. And so this is another element that's both fiscally irresponsible but also a false choice. So this part gets 2 Fs in the bill because it doesn't really leave the money with the the district of origin, because the student's not counted in the funding formula when they become a private student. So again, it's another idea that appears to be something that it's really not.
Well, and to that end, if I could just add, so let's say you had hypothetically 5 students that decided to take advantage of what is being proposed in the Senate. Those 5 students, that would be $6,700 per student that is not calculated into that finance formula for that particular school district. That's not enough to eliminate a program, right? That's not, hopefully it's not going to lead to an education professional being removed from that system. So you have, 5 times 67, that's not going into that district, but there is no savings on the other end. And so I do think people who are trying to suggest that this is somehow going to be revenue neutral, because these are not kids that, we're not paying for people who are currently going to non-public schools, are asking folks to not understand the facts, and they're also not taking into consideration all of the other moving pieces of legislation that are going around this building, right? When we take into consideration the tax reform proposal, when we take into consideration the federal coupling that may happen with the 529 savings plan, that will take additional revenue out of our future coffers, when you also take into consideration the fact that unfortunately it sounds as if the existing majority party would like to renege on property tax backfill that had happened before. We know of that, approximately $60 million would have to be made up by school districts, which again, to Senator Danielson's point, potentially dramatically increases property taxes at the local level. So we can't just look at this situation alone. We have to take into consideration all of the other conversations that are happening and that have not yet been dealt with this legislative session, which is why it's very troubling to me that they would choose now as a time to suggest we could afford this as a state.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, I understand that they can take these education savings accounts until they're 25 years old, and that means we will be giving them $16,000 toward their college education free.
So any remainder of the unobligated $4,000 voucher is eligible to then be rolled over in this account that's to be managed by a private vendor, by the way, that we don't already have a contract with the Department of Management. But I think something else that's interesting to take into consideration is, remember that $12 million amount I mentioned for STOs? You could arguably have a student who is eligible for a $4,000 voucher in addition to their school tuition organization grant. So if the STO technically takes care of everything but $500 worth of tuition in a non-public school, that means that student's eligible to carry over $3,500 to the savings account for their higher education. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but my parents would have loved to have the opportunity to save $3,000 or $3,500 every single year for my higher education expenses. I would have appreciated that as well. But again, we need to focus on how do we help the many, I think, and not try to create a special carve-out for the few.
So what are some things that folks who are interested in supporting these efforts, what can folks do? Who should they be reaching out to? What action should they be taking? What can folks do to support the fighting off this bill?
So the process in the Senate, it has had a subcommittee. It received 2 signatures. I voted against it and will not sign it. It will go, if leadership decides they want to take it up in the Senate, the next step is the Senate Appropriations Committee. So you can go on the legislative website, find the members of the Appropriation Committee and tell them that you do not support it. And the other thing to keep in mind is this is a live round until the very last minute we're here, because it's funnel proof as an appropriations bill. There's a reason that it did not go through the Education Committee in the Senate. That is why. And the new majority leader has said that he has a lot of members who like this bill, so in the Senate, it's a live round. You should know that. Pay attention to the process. Appropriations Committee and then to the floor are the next 2 steps. But I would also, echo what Melissa said. There are at least 3 or 4 other ideas that erode public investment in education that are still live rounds, including the SAVE extension, the 529 tax credit, which will, if the leadership gets what they want, will apply to K-12, not just college. And the budget bills still haven't been even begun for the 19 fiscal year, and there are a number of ways they can go into the budget bills and shift public money to the private education programs that are already on the books that Melissa mentioned. I also believe this bill could potentially be used as a bargaining chip to get votes for the SAVE property tax or sales tax extension for infrastructure in schools. So there's a law called SAVE that allows a penny to be used for infrastructure for schools. It sunsets. And a sunset is bad because it means your bond prices are higher, your all your other inherent costs and uncertainty about your building projects are built into the price of the actual project if you have a law that makes it look like you're not going to fund it. We've been trying for years to get that sunset removed. It's just not good public policy. We actually removed the sunset on bricks and mortar investment for casinos, by the way. So if it's good enough for the casinos, it's good enough for the kids, right?
We totally removed it.
Yes. The same policy that the casinos wanted a few years ago was passed with nary a peep, while the schools want the same sort of certainty about their bonding. And I've always said to people, if it's good enough for the casinos, it's good enough for the kids. So I think this may be used as a bargaining chip. The reason it didn't make it out of the House The Senate really, really wants it. Senate Republicans really, really want it. And I think it may be used as a bargaining chip, this bill, to bargain over whether or not SAVE gets passed. So keep that in mind. And then if you listen to all the other programs that are already out there, I think they're all live rounds for some type of grand bargain at the end of the session.
Is the SAVE bill not supported by Republicans?
It depends.
Okay, so they would
Yep.
have to bargain for those.
There's a reason.
votes.
I like to pay attention to evidence that's in front of me. And there's a reason that the SAVE extension has not passed under the present leadership. If you remember, Governor Branstad used it to pay for his water quality program when he first proposed it, which thankfully went over like a lead balloon.
Yeah.
So this SAVE extension, which is good for public schools, good for communities, actually good for property values, by the way. One of the biggest components of a valuable house is the school district that's around it. So it's actually good economics all the way around, not just education policy. Keep in mind, it has been used in the last couple of years across policy areas to get what other people wanted, separate from the argument for why SAVE should exist in the first place. So, you know, I didn't just fall off the turnip truck. Mama didn't raise no dummy. We got to pay attention to why this bill all of a sudden has emerged when it was all but dead in the House, with a chair who supported it, by the way, and was in charge of the committee. I don't know. Something's going on here, folks. We got to pay attention to it.
If I could, we were able to kill this in the House, and I think a lot of that had to do with the public outcry. So it wasn't just hired guns like myself. It was members of the public coming forward and speaking out of this, including some tax-paying citizens who choose to send their children to private schools, saying, I would never ask a taxpayer dollar go to subsidize my choice. And so whether you're elected official in the House or in the Senate, right, because if this does get additional traction in the Senate, it will end up in the House. They need to hear from you. Democrats need to hear from you. Republicans need to hear from you. And again, it's wonderful if we could start with the Senate Appropriations Committee, but then make sure you're sending the same message to your own elected officials so they know that there is absolutely no question where you stand. And I believe the first eligible opportunity, 2 p.m. tomorrow afternoon, is the next scheduled Senate Appropriations Committee, assuming they don't change that calendar. And so, please, if you have time yet today, you're here, you could go out and you could lobby your elected officials. I will say that the recently elected Senate President Charles Schneider is the one who decided to move this forward and assigned it to the Appropriations Committee. I would assume he's in the building today and would love to hear from some of his constituents or Iowans perhaps on this issue. But yeah, don't let up. We can't assume that this is done at all. And if people have questions, there are lots of different ways to go about receiving information. Iowans for Public Education is a good social media group. There's also Parents for Great Public Schools, another good social media group. My organization, we have some information posted on our isca.org website. But really just want to encourage folks not to let up on this issue. We took it down in the House, and I'm hopeful we might be able to do the same thing with so much outcry about why this is not a good piece of policy for our state if we do the same thing in the Senate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you for being here. So we are scheduled to have Moral Mondays next week. We are, of course, in the point in session where things move and change very quickly. So we want to make sure we're addressing issues that are very pertinent and timely. So stay tuned. If you please sign in so that you make sure to get our emails every week. Thank you to the elected officials in the room. We appreciate you being here and all of the work that you do. We'll see you same bat time, same bat channel next week. Thanks for your support, and go talk to legislators.
Okay.
Bye-bye.